Have you ever wondered if everything you've been taught about Christianity might be completely backwards? What if I told you there's a medieval text that claims Jesus came not as the Son of God, but as a whistleblower exposing the fact that the God of the Bible is actually Satan in disguise? And what if this same text suggests that you're not just a human being, but a fallen angel who's forgotten your true divine nature? Now, before you click away thinking I've lost my mind, stick with me. Because these aren't just random conspiracy theories I'm throwing around. These are actual claims being made in viral videos across social media right now, and they're convincing a lot of people. We're talking millions of views, thousands of comments from people saying things like, "This makes so much sense," and, "Finally, someone's telling the truth about Christianity." The thing is, these ideas aren't new. They come from a 13th century religious movement called the Cathars, and they had a secret text called the Secret Supper that supposedly contains hidden conversations between Jesus and John. According to this text, everything the church teaches is a lie. The Bible was written by Satan, and we're all trapped angels who need to wake up to the truth. So here's my question for you. How do we respond to this? Do we ignore it and hope it goes away? Or do we do what educators we roll up our sleeves and examine the evidence? I'm choosing option 2. And over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to take you on a journey through history, archaeology, and biblical scholarship to show you why these theories don't hold up under scrutiny. But more than that, I want to show you why the real story of Christianity is actually far more compelling, far more beautiful, and far more historically grounded than any alternative narrative. I've spent years studying the historical foundations of Christian faith. I've examined ancient manuscripts, visited archaeological sites, and learned from world-class biblical scholars. What I've discovered is this: when you really dig into the evidence, Orthodox Christianity becomes stronger, not weaker. But before we dive in, let me be honest about why this matters to me personally. I know there are people watching who are genuinely struggling with doubt. Maybe you've seen these viral videos and they've planted uncomfortable questions in your mind. Maybe you're wondering if there's some massive truth you've been missing your whole life. I get it. These theories tap into something deep in human psychology: the desire for hidden knowledge, special insight, explanations for why the world seems broken. That's exactly why we need to examine them carefully, using the same rigorous standards we'd apply to any historical claim. So let's start with the basics. Who were the Cathars, and how did a 13th century religious movement end up at the center of modern conspiracy theories? Picture medieval southern France in the 1100s and 1200s. It's a time of tremendous social upheaval. The Catholic Church wields enormous political power, but it's also showing visible signs of corruption. People are hungry for spiritual authenticity, for something that feels more pure than the institutional Christianity they see around them. Into this environment comes a religious movement calling itself the Pure Ones, the Cathars. But here's our first crucial piece of context that these viral videos conveniently leave out. The Cathars didn't invent these ideas out of thin air. They were part of a much older tradition of religious thinking called Gnosticism that had been circulating for over 1,000 years. The Cathars inherited their core beliefs from groups like the Manichaeans, who got them from the Bogomils, who in turn traced their ideas back to even earlier Gnostic movements from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. This isn't some shocking new revelation that threatened the church establishment. This is a recycling of ancient theories that church leaders had been examining and responding to for centuries. In fact, let me tell you about Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential theologians in Christian history. Before his conversion to Christianity in the 4th century, Augustine spent 9 years as a committed Manichaean. He knew dualistic thinking from the inside. His eventual rejection of Manichaeism was not based on ignorance or institutional pressure. It was based on careful philosophical and theological reasoning that he documented extensively in his writings. Even earlier, church fathers like Irenaeus had written detailed responses to Gnostic beliefs back in the 2nd century. His massive work against heresies systematically examined Gnostic claims and explained why he found them historically and theologically problematic. So when these viral videos present Cathar beliefs as dangerous truths that the church desperately tried to suppress, they're missing a crucial point. The church had been openly discussing, debating, and responding to these ideas for over a millennium by the time the Cathars appeared. But let's dig into what the Cathars actually believed, because understanding their theology is crucial for evaluating their claims. The Cathars were dualists, meaning they believed in two ultimate powers, a good God who created the spiritual realm and an evil God who created the physical world. To them, everything material was inherently corrupt. Your body, food, sexual reproduction, even having children. They taught that good souls had somehow gotten trapped in evil matter, and the goal of existence was to escape the physical world entirely and return to pure spirit. Now, this belief system was actually an attempt to solve one of philosophy's most enduring puzzles, the problem of evil. If God is all good and all powerful, why do bad things happen? Why is there suffering, injustice, and pain in the world? The Cathar solution was elegantly simple. There isn't one God, there are two, and they're at war. The good God didn't create suffering. The evil God did. Problem solved. But simplicity isn't the same thing as truth. And when we examine the Cathar solution more carefully, some serious problems emerge that we need to address systematically. Let's start with their foundational text, this secret supper, that's being quoted extensively in viral videos. As historians, we need to ask some basic questions. When was this written? Who wrote it? What evidence do we have for its authenticity? The secret supper, or interrogation of John, dates to the 13th century, the exact same period when the Cathars were active. It doesn't appear in any early Christian writings. There are no manuscript fragments placing it anywhere near the apostolic era. No early church father references it. No archaeological evidence supports its early dating. This is what scholars call pseudepigraphic literature, texts that falsely claim to be written by famous biblical figures. The ancient world was full of these. We have pseudepigraphic works claiming to be written by Adam, Moses, Enoch, Peter, Mary Magdalene, and dozens of other biblical characters. The early church was very familiar with this phenomenon, which is why they developed careful criteria for determining which texts were genuinely apostolic and which were later fabrications. So when we compare the manuscript evidence for the Secret Supper to the manuscript evidence for the New Testament, we're not even playing in the same league. For the New Testament, we have over 5,800 Greek manuscripts, some dating to within decades of the original compositions. We have thousands more in Latin, Coptic, Syriac, and other early languages. For the Secret Supper, we have a handful of medieval copies, all clearly from the Cathar period, with no early attestation whatsoever. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that we take the Secret Supper seriously as a historical source. What specific claims does it make, and how do they hold up under examination? The text describes Satan's supposed rebellion in vivid detail. According to this account, Satan descended through what the ancients called the four classical elements: air, water, earth, and fire, convincing the angels who governed each element to join his rebellion. The narrative is quite elaborate. Satan approaches the angel of the air and says, "Open unto me the gates of the air," and the angel complies. He does the same with water and earth, but when he reaches fire, described as Gehenna or hell, he can't go any further because of the burning flames. So Satan turns around and goes back up, making deals with the angels he's already convinced. He promises them, "If ye will hearken unto me, I will set my seat in the clouds and be like the Most High, and I will take the waters from this upper firmament and gather together the other parts of the sea, and thereafter there shall be no water upon the face of all the earth, and I will reign with you over the world without end." Essentially, he's offering them a cosmic real estate deal. Help me drain the primordial waters and we'll build an empire on the dry ground that emerges. According to the text, Satan succeeds in recruiting a third of the angels who then get cast out of heaven along with him. Unable to return to the spiritual realm, Satan creates the physical world as his own kingdom and traps these fallen angels in human bodies. Now, this is certainly creative storytelling, but let's think about it logically. If Satan really did create the physical world and authored the Hebrew scriptures to deceive humanity, we should expect those scriptures to serve his purposes, right? They should promote his agenda and hide any information that might expose his deception. But here's where the theory encounters a massive problem. Those same Hebrew scriptures contain over 300 specific prophecies about a coming Messiah who would defeat Satan and redeem humanity. Why would Satan include detailed predictions about his own downfall? Let me give you some concrete examples. Isaiah 53, written 700 years before Christ, describes a suffering servant who would be pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. It says he would be oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter. Psalm 22, written by David centuries before crucifixion was even invented as a method of execution, describes someone whose hands and feet are pierced, and whose executioners divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment. Daniel 9 provides what many scholars consider a precise timeline for the Messiah's appearance, pointing directly to the 1st century AD. If Satan authored these texts to deceive people about his true identity, why would he include a roadmap for his own defeat? That's not the behavior of an ultimate deceiver. That sounds like divine revelation. But the secret supper makes even more specific claims that we can examine. According to this text, Satan didn't just create the world, he orchestrated Jesus' crucifixion in advance. The document claims that when he perceived that I had come down out of heaven into the world, he sent an angel and took of 3 sorts of wood and gave them unto Moses that I might be crucified, and now are they reserved for me. So, supposedly, Satan had his agents prepare the wood for Jesus' cross and give it to Moses to store for future use. That's some serious long-term planning for a cosmic villain. But here's where this claim becomes historically problematic. Moses lived roughly 1,300 years before Christ. The text is asking us to believe that Satan stored wood for 13 centuries, keeping it in perfect condition for a crucifixion that wouldn't happen until the Roman period. Even more bizarrely, the text claims that John the Baptist was actually working for Satan. According to this account, Satan sent John as his agent to identify Jesus for destruction. The text says that when Satan's agent asked how he could recognize Jesus, his master replied, "On whomsoever thou shalt see the Spirit descending like a dove and resting upon him, thou wilt be able to destroy him." So the baptism of Jesus, where the Holy Spirit descended like a dove, was supposedly Satan's way of marking Jesus for death. But think about this logically for a moment. If John the Baptist was Satan's agent sent to identify and destroy Jesus, why did John consistently point people toward Jesus? Why did he say, "Behold, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world"? Why did he tell his own disciples to leave him and follow Jesus instead? The historical evidence shows John decreasing his own influence while increasing Jesus' influence. That's not the behavior of someone trying to destroy Jesus. That's the behavior of someone fulfilling exactly the role the biblical accounts describe. Let's examine another specific claim from the Secret Supper that reveals some of the logical problems with Cathar theology. The text describes Satan creating Adam and Eve by forcing actual angels into physical bodies. According to this account, he devised furthermore and made man in his likeness, and commanded the angel of the 3rd heaven to enter into the body of clay. And he took thereof, and made another body in the form of a woman, and commanded the angel of the 2nd heaven to enter into the body of the woman. The text then describes these trapped angels as horrified by their physical existence. But the angel lamented when they beheld a mortal shape upon them, and that they were unlike in shape. But here's where we encounter a fundamental contradiction in Cathar theology. If the physical world is Satan's creation and entirely evil, where did these angels come from? According to Cathar belief, the good God created only spiritual beings. Satan created only physical matter, but angels are spiritual beings from the good God's realm. So how did Satan gain access to the good God's spiritual creatures to trap them in physical bodies? If the good God is truly all-powerful, how could Satan kidnap his angels? And if Satan somehow did manage this cosmic kidnapping, why would the good God allow it to continue for thousands of years? The Cathar system simply doesn't have coherent answers to these basic logical questions. Let's move from logical problems to historical evidence, because this is where the case for Orthodox Christianity becomes particularly strong. Over the past century and a half, archaeological discoveries have consistently supported biblical historical claims. The discovery of the Hittite Empire, mentioned throughout the Old Testament but unknown to modern historians until the 20th century, vindicated biblical accuracy. The Cyrus Cylinder confirmed the biblical account of the Persian king's policy toward Jewish exiles. The Pilate Stone provided extra-biblical confirmation of Pontius Pilate's governorship in Judea during the exact period described in the Gospels. Most significantly, the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the mid-20th century demonstrated the remarkable accuracy with which Hebrew scriptures were transmitted over centuries. Scrolls dating to the 2nd century BC contained text virtually identical to medieval manuscripts, showing that the biblical text had been preserved with extraordinary fidelity. What archaeological evidence supports Cathar historical claims? This is where we encounter a fundamental problem. Most Cathar claims aren't the kind that would leave archaeological evidence, because they're making metaphysical assertions about spiritual realities rather than historical claims about physical events. But that's precisely the point. Orthodox Christianity makes specific, verifiable historical claims. It says Jesus lived at a particular time, in particular places, interacting with particular people in ways that would have left historical traces. And increasingly, archaeology confirms these details. Cathar theology, by contrast, makes unfalsifiable claims about cosmic spiritual realities that can't be tested against historical evidence. That doesn't necessarily make them false, but it does make them a very different kind of claim from the historical assertions of biblical Christianity. Let's examine the manuscript evidence more closely, because this is crucial for evaluating competing claims about Christian origins. The New Testament enjoys better manuscript attestation than any other ancient document. We have partial manuscripts dating to within decades of the original compositions, complete manuscripts from the 4th century, and thousands of copies in multiple languages from the earliest centuries of Christian history. More importantly, these manuscripts show remarkable consistency despite being copied by hand across diverse geographical regions over many centuries. Textual variants exist, but they're mostly minor spelling differences or word order changes that don't affect meaning. No major Christian doctrine depends on disputed textual readings. For Gnostic texts, like the Secret Supper, the manuscript evidence is dramatically different. We typically have only a few copies, all dating centuries after the supposed events they describe, with no early attestation from church fathers or other historical sources. But there's another type of evidence that is even more compelling: the historical consistency of early Christian teaching across diverse geographical and cultural contexts. Whether you look at churches in Jerusalem, Rome, Alexandria, Antioch, or Corinth, you find the same basic beliefs about Jesus' identity, death, and resurrection. This consistency emerges not from institutional control, but from shared commitment to apostolic teaching. Early Christian writers like Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, and Justin Martyr, writing in different locations and time periods, all affirm the same core Christian beliefs. They don't sound like people who've been told what to believe by a centralized authority. They sound like people sharing testimony about historical events. The Gnostic groups, by contrast, showed enormous diversity and internal contradiction. Valentinian Gnostics taught very different systems from Scythian Gnostics, who differed dramatically from Marcionite Gnostics. There wasn't a coherent Gnostic Christianity. There were dozens of different Gnostic Christianities, often contradicting each other on fundamental questions. This pattern is exactly what you'd expect if Orthodox Christianity preserved authentic apostolic testimony, while Gnostic groups represented later speculative developments that moved away from historical foundations. But let's address the heart of the Cathar appeal, their attempt to solve the problem of evil. Because I think this is really what drives people toward dualistic thinking, and it deserves a serious response. When you look at the world around us, the violence, suffering, injustice, natural disasters, disease, it's natural to ask, if God is truly good and all-powerful, why doesn't He fix this? Why do children get cancer? Why do earthquakes kill innocent people? Why do evil people often prosper while good people suffer? The Cathar answer was to say that the good God didn't create any of this. Satan did. Evil exists because there's an evil creator God making evil things. But notice what this solution actually does. It creates a second deity with enormous creative power. At that point, how is your system really monotheistic? You've essentially got two ultimate powers in the universe, which raises new questions. Where did the evil God come from? Why can't the good God defeat him? If both gods are eternal and ultimate, aren't you really worshiping two gods rather than one? The biblical response to the problem of evil is more complex, but ultimately more satisfying. The Bible teaches that God created everything, and everything He created was good. But it also teaches that God gave His creatures genuine free will, the capacity to make real choices, including the choice to rebel against their Creator. Now you might ask, why would God create beings capable of choosing evil? Wouldn't it have been better to create beings who could only choose good? This gets into some deep philosophical territory, but here's the key insight. Can you have genuine love without genuine freedom? Can you have an authentic relationship without real choice? The biblical perspective is that God wanted creatures who could freely choose to love Him, which necessarily meant creatures who could also freely choose to reject Him. But here's the crucial difference between biblical thinking and Cathar thinking. In the biblical worldview, evil is temporary, not eternal. It doesn't have the last word. The story ends with God renewing creation, wiping away every tear, making all things new. In the Cathar worldview, matter is eternally evil. There's no redemption for the physical world, only escape from it. But in biblical thinking, God so loved the world that He entered it. He didn't remain distant from physical creation. He became part of it. And through His death and resurrection, He opened a way for creation itself to be transformed. Let me tell you why I find this so much more compelling than the Cathar alternative, and it comes down to hope. The Cathar worldview essentially says the physical world is irredeemable. Your body is a prison. Your relationships are illusions. Your work in this world is meaningless distraction. The goal is to escape everything material and return to pure spirit. But the biblical worldview says this world matters to God. Your body matters. That's why Jesus rose physically from the dead. Your relationships matter. That's why love is the greatest commandment. Your work matters. That's why Christians are called to seek justice, care for the poor, and work for human flourishing. Instead of teaching escape from the world, biblical Christianity teaches engagement with the world for its transformation and renewal. And historically, this is exactly what we see. Early Christians weren't trying to flee the physical world. They were actively engaged with it. They cared for the sick during plagues when others fled. They rescued abandoned infants. They fed the hungry and housed the homeless. They worked to improve social conditions for slaves and women. If they really believed the physical world was Satan's irredeemable prison, why would they work so hard to make life better for people trapped in it? The answer is that they believed this world belonged to God, not Satan. Yes, it had been corrupted by human rebellion. Yes, there was genuine evil that needed to be confronted. But the world wasn't fundamentally evil. It was fundamentally good, but temporarily broken. Let me address something else that bothers me about how these viral videos present the historical evidence. They often use the persecution of the Cathars as proof that the Cathars must have been right. The logic seems to be, the church persecuted them, so they must have been telling the truth. But that's not how truth works. People can be persecuted for true beliefs, but they can also be persecuted for false beliefs. Persecution doesn't validate your theology any more than popularity does. The Albigensian Crusade was indeed a tragic episode in Christian history. The violence used against the Cathars was inexcusable and contradicted fundamental Christian principles about human dignity and religious freedom. But the fact that some Christians acted badly doesn't prove that Cathar theology was correct. If we want to evaluate the truth of Cathar beliefs, we need to examine their historical foundations, logical consistency, and adequacy to explain human experience. And when we do that kind of careful examination, Cathar theology comes up short on multiple fronts. Let me give you some specific examples of how archaeological evidence supports Orthodox Christian claims over Cathar alternatives. The Pool of Bethesda, mentioned in John's Gospel as having 5 porticos, was long considered fictional by critics who couldn't find archaeological evidence for such a structure. But 20th century excavations revealed a pool with exactly 5 porticos in precisely the location John described. The Gospels describe Jesus teaching in synagogues throughout Galilee. Archaeological excavations have now uncovered first-century synagogues in Capernaum, Gamla, Herodium, and other locations mentioned in the Gospel accounts. Luke's Gospel demonstrates remarkable accuracy in its descriptions of political titles, geographic details, and cultural practices across the diverse regions of the Roman Empire. Details that would have been easy to get wrong, if Luke were writing centuries later, proved to be precisely accurate for the first century period. The discovery of crucifixion victim remains from the first century confirmed that the gospel descriptions of crucifixion practices were historically accurate, including details that seemed implausible to earlier critics. What comparable archaeological evidence supports Cathar historical claims? Again, we encounter the problem that Cathar beliefs make primarily metaphysical rather than historical assertions. But there's another type of evidence that's particularly important. The early church is a response to Gnostic ideas. If Gnostic beliefs represented authentic Christianity being suppressed by a corrupt institution, we'd expect to find evidence of that suppression in early Christian writings. We'd expect to see church leaders trying to hide or destroy evidence of alternative viewpoints, but that's not what we find at all. Instead, we find writers like Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Hippolytus engaging directly and extensively with Gnostic ideas. They don't try to hide these alternative theories. They describe them in detail and then explain why they find them historically and theologically problematic. These early church fathers don't sound like people trying to suppress truth. They sound like people trying to preserve truth against what they saw as distortion and innovation. More importantly, their arguments weren't based on ecclesiastical authority. They made historical claims. We know what the apostles taught because we learned from people who learned directly from them. They appealed to apostolic succession not as a power grab, but as a historical argument about the preservation of authentic teaching. They pointed to the consistency of Christian teaching across diverse geographical regions as evidence that this teaching came from a common apostolic source. They noted that Gnostic groups, despite claiming special revelation, couldn't agree among themselves about basic doctrinal questions. These are the kinds of arguments historians make when evaluating competing claims about the past. Let's also examine the internal logic of Christian claims compared to Cathar claims, because this reveals some important differences. Orthodox Christianity makes claims that would have been incredibly difficult to fabricate or sustain if they weren't true. The claim that Jesus rose from the dead wasn't some vague spiritual metaphor. Early Christians said specific named people saw Jesus alive after his execution. They provided details. They said you could go talk to these witnesses yourself. If this were a fabrication, it would have been easy to disprove. The authorities could have produced Jesus' body. The supposed witnesses could have been interrogated. The story could have been exposed as fraud. But that's not what happened. Instead, the resurrection message spread rapidly throughout the Roman Empire, often among people who had every reason to be skeptical of it. Compare that to Cathar claims. How would you verify whether Satan really dictated scriptures to Moses? How would you test the assertion that humans are trapped angels? These claims are unfalsifiable. They can't be proven or disproven by historical investigation. Again, that doesn't necessarily make them false, but it does make them very different kinds of claims from the historical assertions of early Christianity. There's another crucial piece of evidence we need to consider: the phenomenon of Christian martyrdom in the early centuries. The historical record shows us people who were willing to die rather than deny their Christian faith. These weren't people dying for abstract philosophical ideas. They were dying because they claimed to have witnessed historical events, particularly the resurrection of Jesus. Now, people will die for beliefs they think are true. But people don't typically die for beliefs they know are false. The willingness of the apostles and early Christians to face persecution and death provides strong evidence that they genuinely believed their testimony about Jesus was historically accurate. What comparable evidence do we have for Cathar claims? The Cathars who died during the Albigensian Crusade showed great courage and conviction, but they were dying for beliefs they had received from others, not for events they claimed to have witnessed personally. That's a significant difference in terms of historical evidence. Let me also address the specific lifestyle practices that emerged from Cathar theology, because these reveal some of the practical problems with dualistic thinking. The Cathars rejected marriage and sexual reproduction because they believed bringing new souls into the material world was inherently evil. They were largely vegetarian, or more precisely, pescatarian, because they believed in the reincarnation of souls, possibly into animal bodies. They avoided eggs, cheese, and milk, any animal products that resulted from reproduction. They rejected water baptism as useless. They despised the cross as a torture instrument. They saw the Eucharist as essentially cannibalistic. Now, I want to be careful here. These weren't necessarily bad people. Many Cathars showed remarkable personal integrity and commitment to their beliefs. But I want you to think about what their theology produced in terms of practical living. If the physical world is inherently evil, if human bodies are prisons created by Satan, if reproduction is participating in cosmic evil, then the logical conclusion is that humanity should simply stop existing. The Cathar worldview, taken to its logical conclusion, leads to the extinction of the human race. That's not a life-affirming theology. That's not a worldview that leads to flourishing, creativity, art, music, literature, or any of the things that make human existence beautiful and meaningful. Compare that to biblical Christianity, which teaches that the physical world is God's good creation, currently fallen but destined for renewal. This worldview leads to engagement with the world for its transformation. It produces hospitals, schools, orphanages, art, music, literature, scientific inquiry, and social reform movements. The practical fruits of these competing worldviews tell us something important about their underlying truth claims. Now, let me address the question of progressive revelation in Scripture, because this is crucial for understanding why the Old and New Testaments can seem different in tone while still being part of the same divine revelation. The Cathar argument essentially says, look at all the violence and harsh commands in the Old Testament. That can't be from the same God who sent Jesus to preach love and forgiveness. Therefore, the Old Testament must be from Satan. But this misunderstands how biblical revelation works. The Bible presents God revealing himself gradually over time, in ways that people in different historical periods could understand and respond to. Think about how you communicate with a 3-year-old versus how you communicate with a teenager versus how you communicate with an adult. The fundamental truths remain the same, but the complexity, nuance, and application change based on the recipient's capacity to understand. God's dealings with ancient Israel involved establishing a nation, giving them laws for social order, and preparing them for the coming of the Messiah. Some of those laws and commands seem harsh to us now, but they need to be understood in their historical context. When God commanded the destruction of Canaanite nations, for example, those weren't arbitrary acts of violence. Historical and archaeological evidence shows that Canaanite religious practices included child sacrifice, temple prostitution, and other forms of systematic cruelty. God's judgment came after centuries of patience and warning. More importantly, these historical events pointed forward to spiritual realities. The conquest of Canaan prefigured Christ's conquest of sin and death. The sacrificial system pointed forward to Christ's ultimate sacrifice. The establishment of Israel as a nation prepared the way for the gospel to go to all nations. This is what theologians call typological fulfillment. Old Testament events and institutions served as types or previews of New Testament realities. Jesus himself affirmed this understanding. He said he came not to abolish the law and the prophets, but to fulfill them. He quoted Old Testament scriptures as authoritative divine revelation. He saw his own death and resurrection as the fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. If Jesus believed the Old Testament came from his Father, not from Satan, shouldn't that settle the question for anyone who accepts Jesus as a reliable teacher? Let me also address the Cathar claim about the cross being a torture device that Christians shouldn't venerate. It's true that crucifixion was a brutal method of execution used by the Romans to terrorize subject populations. The Cathars asked why Christians would wear symbols of torture around their necks. But this misses the point of why the cross became a Christian symbol. Christians don't venerate the cross because they think torture is good. They venerate the cross because it represents God's willingness to enter into human suffering and transform it. The cross symbolizes the fact that there is no depth of human pain, injustice, or evil that God hasn't experienced personally. It represents God's commitment to redeem suffering rather than simply escape from it. More practically, the cross represents the historical event through which God accomplished human redemption. It's not celebrated as an instrument of torture, but as the means by which sin and death were defeated. This brings us to the resurrection, which is Christianity's most distinctive and historically verifiable claim. The resurrection isn't just another miracle story. It's a claim about something that happened in space and time, witnessed by multiple people, recorded by multiple sources, and proclaimed publicly in the very city where Jesus was executed. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, Christianity collapses. Paul himself acknowledged this. If Christ has not been raised, our preaching is useless and so is your faith. But if Jesus did rise from the dead, that changes everything. It validates his claims about his identity. It confirms his teaching about the nature of God. It demonstrates his victory over sin and death. It provides the foundation for Christian hope about life after death and the renewal of creation. The Cathar worldview simply can't account for the resurrection. According to their theology, the physical body is evil matter created by Satan. Why would the good God validate evil matter by raising a physical body from the dead? But biblical Christianity not only can account for the resurrection, it requires it. If God created the physical world and declared it good, if he became incarnate in human flesh, if his plan is to renew rather than escape creation, then physical resurrection makes perfect sense. The historical evidence for the resurrection is actually quite strong when evaluated by normal historical standards. We have multiple independent sources reporting the same basic facts. We have the transformation of the disciples from fearful individuals into bold proclaimers of the resurrection message. We have the conversion of skeptics like Paul and James. We have the rapid growth of Christianity in the very location where these events supposedly occurred. Most importantly, we have the empty tomb. Even critics of Christianity acknowledge that Jesus' tomb was found empty. The question is, what best explains that fact? The early Christian explanation that Jesus rose from the dead accounts for all the evidence we have. Alternative explanations, that the body was stolen, that the disciples went to the wrong tomb, that Jesus wasn't really dead, require us to ignore significant aspects of the historical record. Let me bring all of this together by addressing why I think the biblical worldview is not only more historically grounded than Cathar alternatives, but also more hopeful and more adequate to human experience. The Cathar worldview essentially says that existence itself is a mistake. You're a trapped spirit in an evil world created by a cosmic villain, and your goal should be to escape back to pure spiritual existence. But think about what this means for how you relate to everything around you. Your body is a prison to be escaped. Your relationships are illusions to be transcended. Your work in the world is meaningless distraction. Physical pleasure, artistic beauty, human creativity, all of these are temptations that keep you trapped in Satan's material world. That's not just a depressing way to live. It's a worldview that can't account for the genuine goods we experience in physical existence. Why does music move us so deeply if the physical world is entirely evil? Why do we find mathematical beauty and scientific discovery so compelling? Why are love, friendship, and community so central to human flourishing? The biblical worldview, by contrast, says that you are a beloved creature made in God's image, living in a good but fallen world, offered redemption through Christ's death and resurrection, and called to participate in God's work of renewing creation. This worldview doesn't ask you to despise the physical world or try to escape from it. Instead, it asks you to see the physical world as God's good creation that has been corrupted by rebellion but is destined for restoration. When you hug your child, biblical Christianity says that physical affection matters because bodies matter to God. When you share a meal with friends, it says that fellowship around a table reflects something deep about how God designed us for community. When you work to make the world more just, more beautiful, or more flourishing, it says that work has eternal significance because this world has eternal significance to God. The biblical story isn't about escape from creation. It's about the redemption of creation. It's not about abandoning the physical world. It's about transforming it. It's not about secret knowledge available only to spiritual elites. It's about good news proclaimed openly to everyone. And that brings me to my final point, the question of accessibility. Gnostic systems, including Cathar theology, typically claimed that salvation was available only to those who received special spiritual knowledge. There were spiritual elites who got it, and spiritual commoners who didn't. But biblical Christianity claims that the gospel is available to everyone, rich and poor, educated and uneducated, powerful and powerless. The truth about God isn't hidden in secret texts, available only to the initiated. It's been proclaimed openly for 2,000 years. Jesus didn't teach his disciples to hide truth from the masses. He told them to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. He said his message was for children as much as adults, for the simple as much as the sophisticated. That's not the strategy of someone trying to maintain power through hidden knowledge. That's the strategy of someone offering genuine good news to everyone who will receive it. So where does all of this leave us? We live in an age where alternative theories about Christianity spread rapidly through social media, often packaged in compelling ways that appeal to our natural curiosity about hidden knowledge and our understandable frustration with religious institutions that sometimes fail to live up to their ideals. But I want to encourage you to do what the Bereans did in Acts 17, examine the scriptures daily to see whether these things are true. Don't just accept any explanation because it sounds intriguing or because it's presented with confidence. Look at the historical evidence. Examine the manuscript evidence. Consider the logical consistency of different claims. Ask yourself, what explanation best accounts for all the evidence we have? When you do that kind of careful examination, I believe you'll find that Orthodox Christianity stands up to scrutiny better than its alternatives, not because it's simpler or more comfortable, but because it's more consistent with historical evidence and more adequate to explain human experience. The story Christianity tells is this: you are a beloved creature made in God's image, living in a good but fallen world, offered redemption through Jesus Christ's death and resurrection, and invited to participate in God's work of renewing all creation. That's not a story about escaping the world. It's a story about transforming it. It's not a story about despising the physical. It's a story about redeeming it. It's not a story about hidden knowledge available only to the enlightened few. It's a story about good news proclaimed openly to everyone who will listen. The truth about God isn't hidden in some secret medieval text that the church tried to suppress. It's been proclaimed from the rooftops for 2 millennia. Jesus Christ died for your sins and rose from the dead. That's not a secret that was hidden. That's good news that was announced. And it's an invitation that remains open to anyone who will receive it. That's the real story of Christianity. And it's a story worth believing, worth living, and worth proclaiming to a world that desperately needs hope.